Chapter 20 of Erasmus and the Age of Reformation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Erasmus and the Age of Reformation by Johan Huizinga. Translated by Frederick Jan Hopman. Chapter 20. Last Years. Religious and political contrasts grow sharper. The coming strife in Germany is still suspended. Erasmus finishes his Ecclesiastes. Death of Fisher and More. Erasmus back at Basel, 1535. Pope Paul III wants to make him write in favor of the cause of the Council. Favors declined by Erasmus. De Puritate Ecclesiae. The end, 12th July, 1536. During the last years of Erasmus's life, all the great issues which kept the world in suspense were rapidly taking threatening forms. Wherever compromise or reunion had before still seemed possible, sharp conflicts, clearly outlined party groupings, binding formulas were now barring the way to peace. While in the spring of 1529 Erasmus prepared for his departure from Basel, a strong Catholic majority at the Diet at Speyer got the recess of 1526, favorable for the evangelicals, revoked, only the Lutherans among them keeping what they had obtained, and secured a prohibition of any further changes or novelties. The Zwinglians and Anabaptists were not allowed to enjoy the least tolerance. This was immediately followed by the protest of the chief evangelical princes and towns, which henceforth was to give the name to all anti-Catholics together, 19 April 1529. And not only between Catholics and Protestants in the empire did the rupture become complete. Even before the end of that year, the question of the Lord's Supper proved an insuperable stumbling block in the way of a real union of Zwinglians and Lutherans. Luther parted from Zwingli at the colloquy of Marburg with the words, "Your spirit differs from ours." In Switzerland, civil war had openly broken out between the Catholic and the evangelical cantons, only calmed for a short time by the first peace of Kappel. The treaties of Cambrai and Barcelona, which in 1529 restored at least political peace in Christendom for the time being, could no longer draw from old Erasmus jubilations about a coming golden age like those with which the Concord of 1516 had inspired him. A month later the Turks appeared before Vienna. All these occurrences could not but distress and alarm Erasmus, but he was outside them. When reading his letters of that period, we are more than ever impressed by the fact that, for all the width and liveliness of his mind, he is remote from the great happenings of his time. Beyond a certain circle of interests touching his own ideas or his person, his perceptions are vague and weak. If he still meddles occasionally with questions of the day, he does so in the moralizing manner, by means of generalities without emphasis. His advice about declaring war on the Turks, March 1530, is written in the form of an interpretation of Psalm 28, and so vague that at the close he himself anticipates that the reader may exclaim, "But now say clearly, do you think that war should be declared or not?" In the summer of 1530, the Diet met again at Augsburg under the auspices of the Emperor himself, to try once more to, quote, "attain to a good peace and Christian truth." End quote. The Augsburg Confession, defended all too weakly by Melanchthon, was read here, disputed, and declared refuted by the Emperor. Erasmus had no share in all this. Many had exhorted him in letters to come to Augsburg, but he had in vain expected a summons from the Emperor. At the instance of the Emperor's councillors, he had postponed his proposed removal to Brabant in that autumn till after the decision of the Diet. But his services were not needed for the drastic resolution of repression with which the Emperor closed the session in November. The great struggle in Germany seemed to be approaching. The resolutions of Augsburg were followed by the formation of the League of Schmalkalden, uniting all Protestant territories and towns of Germany in their opposition to the emperor. In the same year, 1531, Zwingli was killed in the Battle of Kappel against the Catholic cantons, soon to be followed by Oecolampadius, who died at Basel. "It is right," writes Erasmus, "that those two leaders have perished. If Mars had been favorable to them, we should now have been done for." In Switzerland a sort of equilibrium had set in. At any rate, matters had come to a standstill. In Germany the inevitable struggle was postponed for many years. The emperor had understood that to combat the German Protestants effectively, he should first get the Pope to hold the council which would abolish the acknowledged abuses of the Church. The religious peace of Nuremberg, 1532, put the seal upon this turn of imperial policy. It might seem as if before long the advocates of moderate reform and of a compromise might after all get a chance of being heard. But Erasmus had become too old to actively participate in the decisions, if he had ever seriously considered such participation. He does write a treatise, though, in 1533, on the sweet concord of the Church, like his advice on the Turks, in the form of an interpretation of a psalm, 83. But it would seem as if the old vivacity of his style and his power of expression, so long unimpaired, now began to flag. The same remark applies to an essay on the preparation for death, published the same year. His voice was growing weaker. During these years he turned his attention chiefly to the completion of the great work which more than any other represented for him the summing up and complete exposition of his moral theological ideas, Ecclesiastes, or On the Way to Preach. Erasmus had always regarded preaching as the most dignified part of an ecclesiastic's duties. As preachers he had most highly valued Colet and Betrarius. As early as 1519, his friend John Becker of Borselen urged him to follow up the Enchiridion of the Christian soldier and the Institutio of the Christian prince by the true instruction of the Christian preacher. Later, Erasmus had promised him, "At present I have too much work, but I hope to undertake it soon." In 1523 he had already made a sketch and some notes for it. It was meant for John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, Erasmus's great friend and brother spirit, who eagerly looked forward to it and urged the author to finish it. The work gradually grew into the most voluminous of Erasmus's original writings, a forest of a work, operis sylvam, as he calls it himself. In 4 books he treated his subject, the art of preaching well and decorously, with an inexhaustible abundance of examples, illustrations, schemes, etc. But was it possible that a work conceived already by the Erasmus of 1519, and upon which he had been so long engaged, while he himself had gradually given up the boldness of his earlier years, could still be a revelation in 1533, as the Enchiridion had been in its day? Ecclesiastes is the work of a mind fatigued, which no longer sharply reacts upon the needs of his time. As the result of a correct, intellectual, tasteful instruction in a suitable manner of preaching, in accordance with the purity of the gospel, Erasmus expects to see society improve. Quote, "The people become more obedient to the authorities, more respectful towards the law, more peaceable. Between husband and wife comes greater concord, more perfect faithfulness, greater dislike of adultery. Servants obey more willingly, artisans work better, merchants cheat no more." End quote. At the same time that Erasmus took this work to Froben at Basel to print, a book of a young Frenchman who had recently fled from France to Basel passed through the press of another Basel printer, Thomas Platte. It too was to be a manual of the life of faith, the institution of the Christian religion by Calvin. Even before Erasmus had quite completed the Ecclesiastes, the man for whom the work had been meant was no more. Instead of to the Bishop of Rochester, Erasmus dedicated his voluminous work to the Bishop of Augsburg, Christopher of Stadien. John Fisher, to set a seal on his spiritual endeavors, resembling those of Erasmus in so many respects, had left behind as a testimony to the world, for which Erasmus knew himself too weak, that of martyrdom. On 22nd June 1535, he was beheaded by command of Henry VIII. He died for being faithful to the old church. Together with More, he had steadfastly refused to take the oath to the Statute of Supremacy. Not 2 weeks after Fisher, Thomas More mounted the scaffold. The fate of those two noblest of his friends grieved Erasmus. It moved him to do what for years he had no longer done, to write a poem. But rather than in the fine Latin measure of that Carmen Heroicum, one would have liked to hear his emotion in language of sincere dismay and indignation in his letters. They are hardly there. In the words devoted to Fisher's death in the preface to the Ecclesiastes, there is no heartfelt emotion. Also in his letters of those days, he speaks with reserve. Quote, "Would More had never meddled with that dangerous business, and left the theological cause to the theologians," end quote. As if More had died for aught but simply for his conscience. When Erasmus wrote these words, he was no longer at Freiburg. He had, in June 1535, gone to Basel, to work in Froben's printing office as of old. The Ecclesiastes was at last going to press, and still required careful supervision and the final touches during the process. The Adagia had to be reprinted, and a Latin edition of Origenes was in preparation. The old sick man was cordially received by the many friends who still lived at Basel. Hieronymus Froben, Johannes' son, who after his father's death managed the business with two relatives, sheltered him in his house zum Luft. In the hope of his return, a room had been built expressly for him, and fitted up as was convenient for him. Erasmus found that at Basel the ecclesiastical storms which had formerly driven him away had subsided. Quiet and order had returned. He did feel a spirit of distrust in the air, it is true. Quote, "But I think that on account of my age, of habits, and of what little erudition I possess, I have now got so far that I may live in safety anywhere." End quote. At first he had regarded the removal as an experiment. He did not mean to stay at Basel. If his health could not stand the change of air, he would return to his fine, well-appointed, comfortable house at Freiburg. If he should prove able to bear it, then the choice was between the Netherlands, probably Brussels, Malines, or Antwerp, perhaps Louvain, or Burgundy, in particular Besançon. Towards the end of his life he clung to the illusion, which he had been cherishing for a long time, that Burgundy wine alone was good for him and kept his malady in check. There is something pathetic in the proportions which this wine question gradually assumes. That it is so dear at Basel might be overlooked, but the thievish wagoners drink up or spoil what is imported. In August he doubted greatly whether he will return to Freiburg. In October he sold his house and part of his furniture, and had the rest transported to Basel. After the summer he hardly left his room, and was mostly bedridden. Though the formidable worker in him still yearned for more years and time to labor, his soul was ready for death. Happy he had never felt. Only during the last years he utters his longing for the end. He was still, curiously enough, subject to the delusion of being in the thick of the struggle. "In this arena I shall have to fall," he writes in 1533. "Only this consoles me, that near at hand already the general haven comes in sight, which, if Christ be favorable, will bring the end of all labor and trouble. 2 years later, his voice sounds more urgent. That the Lord might deign to call me out of this raving world to his rest. Most of his old friends were gone. Warham and Mountjoy had passed away before Moore and Fisher. Peter Gillis, so many years younger than he, had departed in 1533. Also, Pirkheimer had been dead for years. Beatus Renanus shows him to us during the last months of his life, reperusing his friends' letters of the last 2 years, and repeating, "This one too is dead." As he grew more solitary, his suspiciousness and his feeling of being persecuted became stronger. "My friends decrease, my enemies increase," he writes in 1532, when Warham had died, and Aleander has risen still higher. In the autumn of 1535, he thinks that all his former servant pupils betray him, even the best beloved ones, like Quirintellesius and Charles Utenhof. They do not write to him, he complains. In October 1534, Pope Clement VII was succeeded by Paul III, who at once zealously took up the council question. The meeting of a council was, in the eyes of many, the only means by which union could be restored to the Church, and now a chance of realizing this seemed nigh. At once the most learned theologians were invited to help in preparing the great work. Erasmus did not omit, in January 1535, to address to the new pope a letter of congratulation, in which he professed his willingness to cooperate in bringing about the pacification of the Church, and warned the pope to steer a cautious middle course. On 31st May followed a reply full of kindliness and acknowledgment. The pope exhorted Erasmus that you too, graced by God with so much laudable talent and learning, may help us in this pious work, which is so agreeable to your mind, to defend with us the Catholic religion, by the spoken and the written word, before and during the council, and in this manner, by this last work of piety, as by the best act to close a life of religion and so many writings, to refute your accusers and rouse your admirers to fresh efforts." Would Erasmus, in years of greater strength, have seen his way to cooperate actively in the Council of the Great? Undoubtedly, the Pope's exhortation correctly represented his inclination. But, once faced by the necessity of hard, clear resolutions, what would he have effected? Would the spirit of peace and toleration, of reserve and compromise, have brought alleviation and warded off the coming struggle? He was spared the experiment. He knew himself too weak to be able to think of strenuous church political propaganda any more. Soon there came proofs that the kindly feelings at Rome were sincere. There had been some question also of numbering Erasmus among the cardinals who were to be nominated with a view to the council. A considerable benefice connected with the Church of Deventer was already offered him. But Erasmus urged the Roman friends who were thus active in his behalf to seize their kind offices. He would accept nothing. He, a man who lived from day to day in expectation of death and often hoping for it, who could hardly ever leave his room, would people instigate him to a hunt for deaneries and cardinals' hats? He had subsistence enough to last him. He wanted to die independent. Yet his pen did not rest. The Ecclesiastes had been printed and published, and Origenes was still to follow. Instead of the important and brilliant task to which Rome called him, he devoted his last strength to a simple deed of friendly cordiality. The friend to whose share the honor fell to receive from the old death-sick author a last composition prepared expressly for him amidst the most terrible pains, was the most modest of the number who had not lost their faith in him. No prelate or prince, no great wit or admired divine, but Christopher Eschenfelde, customs officer at Boppard on the Rhine. On his passage in 1518, Erasmus had, with glad surprise, found him to be a reader of his work and a man of culture. That friendship had been a lasting one. Eschenfelde had asked Erasmus to dedicate the interpretation of some psalm to him, a form of composition often preferred by Erasmus of late. About the close of 1535, he remembered that request. He had forgotten whether Eschenfelde had indicated a particular psalm and chose one at haphazard, Psalm 14, calling the treatise on the purity of the Christian Church. He expressly dedicated it to the publican in January 1536. It is not remarkable among his writings as to contents and form, but it was to be his last. On 12th February 1536, Erasmus made his final preparations. In 1527 he had already made a will with detailed clauses for the printing of his complete works by Froben. In 1534 he drew up an accurate inventory of his belongings. He sold his library to the Polish nobleman Johannes a Lasko. The arrangements of 1536 testify to two things which had played an important part in his life: his relations with the house of Froben and his need of friendship. Boniface Amerbach is his heir. Hieronymus Froben and Nicholas Episcopius, the managers of the business, are his executors. To each of the good friends left to him he bequeathed one of the trinkets which spoke of his fame with princes and the great ones of the earth. In the first place to Louis Baer and Beatus Rhenanus. The poor and the sick were not forgotten, and he remembered especially girls about to marry and youths of promise. The details of this charity he left to Amerbach. In March 1536, he still thinks of leaving for Burgundy. Money matters occupy him, and he speaks of the necessity of making new friends, for the old ones leave him, the Bishop of Krakow, Zasius at Freiburg. According to Beatus Rhenanus, the Brabant plan stood foremost at the end of Erasmus's life. The regent, Mary of Hungary, did not cease to urge him to return to the Netherlands. Erasmus's own last utterance leaves us in doubt whether he had made up his mind. Quote, "Though I am living here with the most sincere friends, such as I did not possess at Freiburg, I should yet, on account of the differences of doctrine, prefer to end my life elsewhere, if only Brabant were nearer." End quote. This he writes on 28 June 1536. He had felt so poorly for some days that he had not even been able to read. In the letter we again trace the delusion that Aleander persecutes him, sets on opponents against him, and even lays snares for his friends. Did his mind at last give way too? On 12th July the end came. The friends around his couch heard him groan incessantly, "O Jesu misericordia, Domine libera me, Domine miserere mei," and at last in Dutch, "Lieve God." End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Erasmus and the Age of Reformation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cook. Erasmus and the Age of Reformation by Johan Huizinga. Translated by Frederick Jan Hopman. Chapter 21. Conclusion. Looking back on the life of Erasmus, the question still arises, why has he remained so great? For ostensibly his endeavors ended in failure. He withdraws in alarm from the tremendous struggle which he rightly calls a tragedy. The 16th century, bold and vehement, thunders past him, disdaining his ideal of moderation and tolerance. Latin literary erudition, which to him was the epitome of all true culture, has gone out as such. Erasmus, so far as regards the greater part of his writings, is among the great ones who are no longer read. he has become a name. But why does that name still sound so clear and articulate? Why does he keep regarding us as if he still knew a little more than he has ever been willing to utter? What has he been to his age, and what was he to be for later generations? Has he been rightly called the precursor of the modern spirit? Regarded as a child of the 16th century, he does seem to differ from the general tenor of his times. Among those vehemently passionate, drastically energetic, and violent natures of the great ones of his day, Erasmus stands as the man of too few prejudices, with a little too much delicacy of taste, with a deficiency, though not indeed in every department, of that stultitia which he had praised as a necessary constituent of life. Erasmus is the man who is too sensible and moderate for the heroic. What a surprising difference there is between the accent of Erasmus and that of Luther, Calvin, and St. Teresa. What a difference also between his accent, that is, the accent of humanism, and that of Albrecht Dürer, of Michelangelo, or of Shakespeare. Erasmus seems at times the man who was not strong enough for his age. In that robust 16th century, it seems as if the oaken strength of Luther was necessary, the steely edge of Calvin, the white heat of Loyola, not the velvet softness of Erasmus. Not only were their force and their fervor necessary, but also their depth, their unsparing, undaunted consistency, sincerity, and outspokenness. They cannot bear that smile which makes Luther speak of the guileful being looking out of Erasmus's features. His piety is too even for them, too limp. Loyola has testified that the reading of the Enchiridion Militis Christiani relaxed his fervor and made his devotion grow cold. He saw that warrior of Christ differently, and the glowing colors of the Spanish Christian, medieval ideal of chivalry. Erasmus had never passed through those depths of self-reprobation and that consciousness of sin which Luther had traversed with toil. He saw no devil to fight with, and tears were not familiar to him. Was he altogether unaware of the deepest mystery, or did it rest in him too deep for utterance? Let us not suppose too quickly that we are more nearly allied to Luther or to Loyola because their figures appeal to us more. If at present our admiration goes out again to the ardently pious and to spiritual extremes, it is partly because our unstable time requires strong stimuli. To appreciate Erasmus, we should begin by giving up our admiration of the extravagant, and for many this requires a certain effort at present. It is extremely easy to break the staff over Erasmus. His faults lie on the surface, and though he wished to hide many things, he never hid his weaknesses. He was much too concerned about what people thought, and he could not hold his tongue. His mind was too rich and facile, always suggesting a superfluity of arguments, cases, examples, and quotations. He could never let things slide. All his life he grudged himself leisure to rest and collect himself, to see how unimportant, after all, was the commotion round about him. If only he went his own way courageously. Rest and independence he desired more ardently of all things. There was no more restless and dependent creature. Judge him as one of the too delicate constitution who ventures out in a storm. His willpower was great enough. He worked night and day amidst the most violent bodily suffering, with a great ideal steadfastly before him, never satisfied with its own achievements. He was not self-sufficient. As an intellectual type, Erasmus was one of a rather small group, the absolute idealists who, at the same time, are thoroughly moderate. They cannot bear the world's imperfections. They feel constrained to oppose. But extremes are uncongenial to them. They shrink back from action because they know it pulls down as much as it erects, and so they withdraw themselves and keep calling that everything should be different. But when the crisis comes, they reluctantly side with tradition and conservatism. Here, too, is a fragment of Erasmus's life tragedy. He was the man who saw the new and coming things more clearly than anyone else, who must needs quarrel with the old, and yet could not accept the new. He tried to remain in the fold of the old church after having damaged it seriously, and renounced the Reformation, and to a certain extent even humanism, after having furthered both with all his strength. Our final opinion about Erasmus has been concerned with negative qualities so far. What was his positive importance? Two facts make it difficult for the modern mind to understand Erasmus's positive importance. First, that his influence was extensive rather than intensive, and therefore less historically discernible at definite points. And second, that his influence has ceased. He has done his work and will speak to the world no more. Like St. Jerome, his revered model, and Voltaire, with whom he has been occasionally compared, he has his reward. But like them, he has been the enlightener of an age from whom a broad stream of culture emanated. As historic investigation of the French Revolution is becoming more and more aware that the true history of France during that period should be looked for in those groups which, as Centre or Marius, seem for a long time but a drove of supernumeraries, and understands that it should occasionally protect its eyes a little from the lightning flashes of the Gironde and mountain thunderstorm. So the history of the Reformation period should pay attention, and it has done so for a long time, to the broad central sphere permeated by the Erasmian spirit. One of his opponents said, quote, "Luther has drawn a large part of the church to himself, Zwingli and Oecolampadius also some part, but Erasmus the largest." End quote. Erasmus's public was numerous and of high culture. He was the only one of the humanists who really wrote for all the world, that is to say, for all educated people. He accustomed a whole world to another and more fluent mode of expression. He shifted the interest. He influenced by his perfect clarity of exposition, even through the medium of Latin, the style of the vernacular languages, apart from the numberless translations of his works. For his contemporaries, Erasmus put on many new stops, one might say, of the great organ of human expression, as Rousseau was to do 2 centuries later. He might well think with some complacency of the influence he had exerted on the world. Quote, "From all parts of the world," he writes towards the close of his life, "I am daily thanked by many, because they have been kindled by my works, whatever may be their merit, into a zeal for a good disposition and sacred literature, and they who have never seen Erasmus yet know and love him from his books." End quote. He was glad that his translations from the Greek had become superfluous. He had everywhere led many to take up Greek and Holy Scriptures, quote, "which otherwise they would have never read." End quote. He had been an introducer and an initiator. He might leave the stage after having said his say. His word signified something beyond classical sense and biblical disposition. It was at the same time the first enunciation of the creed of education and perfectibility, of warm social feeling and of faith in human nature, of peaceful kindness and toleration. Quote, "Christ dwells everywhere. Piety is practiced under every garment, if only a kindly disposition is not wanting." End quote. In all these ideas and convictions, Erasmus really heralds a later age. In the 16th and 17th centuries, those thoughts remained an undercurrent. In the 18th, Erasmus's message of deliverance bore fruit. In this respect, he has most certainly been a precursor and a preparer of the modern mind, of Rousseau, Herder, Pestalozzi, and of the English and American thinkers. It is only part of the modern mind which is represented by all this. To a number of its developments, Erasmus was wholly a stranger. To the evolution of natural science, of the newer philosophy, of political economy. But insofar as people still believe in the ideal that moral education and general tolerance may make humanity happier, humanity owes much to Erasmus. This does not imply that Erasmus's mind did not directly and fruitfully influence his own times. Although Catholics regarded him in the heat of the struggle as the corrupter of the Church, and Protestants as the betrayer of the gospel, yet his word of moderation and kindliness did not pass by unheard or unheeded on either side. Eventually, neither camp finally rejected Erasmus. Rome did not brand him as an arch-heretic, but only warned the faithful to read him with caution. Protestant history has been studious to reckon him as one of the reformers. Both obeyed in this the pronouncement of a public opinion which was above parties and which continued to admire and revere Erasmus. To the reconstruction of the Catholic Church and the erection of the evangelical churches, not only the names of Luther and Loyola are linked. The moderate, the intellectual, the conciliating have also had their share of the work. Figures like Melanchthon here, Sadolet there, both nearly allied to Erasmus and sympathetically disposed towards him. The frequently repeated attempts to arrive at some compromise in the great religious conflict, though they might be doomed to end in failure, emanated from the Erasmian spirit. Nowhere did that spirit take root so easily as in the country that gave Erasmus birth. A curious detail shows us that it was not the exclusive privilege of either great party. Of his two most favored pupils of later years, both Netherlanders, whom as the actors of the colloquy Astragallismus, the game of knucklebones, he has immortalized together. The one, Quirentesius, died for his attachment to the Spanish cause and the Catholic faith. He was hanged in 1572 by the citizens of Haarlem, where he was the burgomaster. The other, Charles Utenhove, was sedulous on the side of the revolt and the Reformed religion. At Ghent, in concert with the Prince of Orange, he turned against the narrow-minded Protestant terrorism of the Zealots. A Dutch historian recently tried to trace back the opposition of the Dutch against the King of Spain to the influence of Erasmus's political thought in his arraignment of bad princes. Wrongly, I think. Erasmus's political diatribes were far too academic and too general for that. The desire of resistance and revolt arose from quite other causes. The Gueux were not Erasmus's progeny, but there is much that is Erasmian in the spirit of their great leader, William of Orange, whose vision ranged so widely beyond the limitations of religious hatred. Thoroughly permeated by the Erasmian spirit, too, was that class of municipal magistrates who were soon to take the lead and to set the fashion in the established republic. History is wont, as always with an aristocracy, to take their faults very seriously. After all, perhaps no other aristocracy, unless it be that of Venice, had ruled a state so long, so well, and with so little violence. If in the 17th century the institutions of Holland, in the eyes of foreigners, were the admired models of prosperity, charity, and social discipline, and patterns of gentleness and wisdom, however defective they may seem to us, then the honor of all this is due to the municipal aristocracy. If, in the Dutch patriciate of that time, those aspirations lived and were translated into action, it was Erasmus's spirit of social responsibility which inspired them. The history of Holland is far less bloody and cruel than that of any of the surrounding countries. Not for naught did Erasmus praise as truly Dutch those qualities which we may also call truly Erasmian: gentleness, kindness, moderation, a generally diffused moderate erudition. Not romantic virtues, if you like, but are they less salutary? One more instance. In the Republic of the Seven Provinces, the atrocious executions of witches and wizards ceased more than a century before they did in all other countries. This was not owing to the merit of the Reformed pastors. They shared the popular belief which demanded persecution. It was the magistrates whose enlightenment, even as early as the beginning of the 17th century, no longer tolerated these things. Again, we are entitled to say, though Erasmus was not one of those who combated this practice, the spirit which breathes from this is that of Erasmus. Cultured humanity has cause to hold Erasmus's memory in esteem, if for no other reason than that he was the fervently sincere preacher of that general kindliness which the world still so urgently needs. End of chapter 21. End of Erasmus and the Age of Reformation by Johan Huizinga, translated by Frederick Jan Hoppeman.